Okay, folks, let's get started talking about where we left off here in regards to Eastern absolutism. So, looking at, so you guys watched a documentary on the rise of Peter the Great, who we're going to be talking a bit more about in class today. Where did we talk? We left off right around here. Okay, so, serfdom. Talking about serfdom, just to remind you that serfdom was more prevalent in Eastern Europe than it was in Western Europe. And particularly after 1300, lords in Eastern Europe revived serfdom to combat increasing economic challenges in Eastern Europe. The areas most affected by the return of serfdom included Bohemia, which is the Czech Republic, Silesia, Hungary, Eastern Germany, Poland, Lithuania, and of course Russia. Now, the drop in the population in the 1300s, especially from the Black Death, had created tremendous labor shortages and hard times for nobles, which necessitated their use of serfs to be able to continue to have wealth, as well as to be able to punitively treat the serfs in a much more harsh fashion than, say, peasants in Western Europe would have been treated. Lords demanded that their kings and princes issue laws restricting or eliminating peasants' rights of moving freely, hence making them serfs. Lords confiscated peasant lands and imposed heavier labor obligations to them. One such example is the robot, which is the thing where peasants or serfs were required to work 3 to 4 days without pay per week for their local lord. And serfdom continued to consolidate between 1500 and 1650. Hereditary serfdom was reestablished in Poland. So if you're born a serf, all of your kids would be serfs, as well as Russia and Prussia by the mid-17th century, the mid-1600s. So this period saw the growth of estate agriculture, particularly in Poland and Eastern Germany. Why was serfdom in Eastern Europe but not Western Europe? Well, the reasons were not solely economic, as Western Europe also experienced the Black Death. So if it was only economic, it would have happened everywhere. But the supremacy of noble landlords, basically most kings, in fact, were essentially first among equals in the noble class. In other words, all nobles in Eastern Europe were considered amongst equals, but the king was just the first among all other equals. And the nobles directly benefited from serfdom. Eastern lords had more political power than Western lords did. So monarchs really needed the nobles in Eastern Europe, as opposed to in Western Europe, they attempted to subdue the nobles who were a threat to their rule in Western Europe. Constant warfare in Eastern Europe, as well as political chaos, resulted in the noble landlord class increasing their political power very much at the expense of monarchs. So, at first glance, this might sound kind of anti-absolutist in a way. If you're saying that all of these nobles have all of the equal power as the king, essentially, and that the king is very reliant on the nobles, then how is it absolutism? Well, over time, it does develop into absolutism. Weak Eastern kings had little power to control landlord policies aimed at peasants. Peasants were weaker politically than in the West as well. Weaker politically in the East than they were in the West, that is. And landlords undermined medieval privileges of town and power of urban classes. So all of these are factors as to why serfdom and the supremacy of noble landlords existed in Eastern Europe. Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the rise of Austria. The ruler of Austria was traditionally selected as Holy Roman Emperor. Now, the Habsburgs no longer ruled Spain after 1713, because remember that the last Habsburg Spanish monarch, Carlos II, initiated the War of Spanish Succession by leaving the Spanish throne to his friend Philip, Duke of Anjou, also heir to the French throne, and that created that last war of Louis XIV of France. The Habsburg Empire now included Sardinia, Milan, and Naples, the Austrian Netherlands, which is previously the Spanish Netherlands, that's Belgium, what is now modern-day Belgium, but now it belongs to Austria, and then Hungary and Transylvania as well. So if we take a look at this map here, the Habsburg Empire in 1700, you can see that prior to the War of Spanish Succession, the senior branch, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg monarch, was located over here, and it controlled the Spanish Netherlands as well as territories like Milan, Sardinia, Sicily, and Naples. The junior branch, the Austrian Habsburg branch, was over here in the Holy Roman Empire, which had a bunch of influence, across the rest of the Holy Roman Empire, even though they were not formally, technically, territories of Austria, which is why they're in this barred color here. But after the War of Spanish Succession, we see that basically that region there falls under the influence of Austria now, and as well as these regions over here in Italy, and of course these regions over here. Here is actually Austria right there, and then Hungary, and then all the way over into what is now Romania and stuff like that. All right, and here's Galicia over here. The government organization, basically, the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian Empire, is not a national state. It's a multinational empire, and I was mentioning this last week. You have Austria proper, which contains both Germans and Italians. Then you also had Bohemia, which fell under the rule of Austria, which was Czechs and Germans. And then you had Hungary, which was Hungarians, Serbs, Croats, and Romanians. And there's no single constitutional system within the Austrian Habsburg dynasty. Some important Habsburg rulers that some of whom we've talked about: Ferdinand II, who gained Bohemia during the 30 Years' War; Ferdinand III, who centralized the government in the old hereditary provinces of Austria. There was a ruler of the Habsburgs by the name of Leopold I. Don't get the Leopold from the Habsburg dynasty in Austria confused with the Leopold of Belgium that comes later on down the line, as the Leopold from Belgium rules in the late 1800s and is best known for the exploitation of the Congo in Africa. So they are two different Leopolds. Leopold I was more interested in restricting Protestantism because Austria was a Catholic state. There was something known as the Siege of Vienna under Leopold I, where the Austrians successfully repelled the Turks from the gates of Vienna in 1683, and that was the last attempt by the Turks to take control of Central Europe. Another famous Habsburg ruler was Emperor Charles VI. He reigned Austria from 1711 to 1740. Austria was saved from Louis XIV during the War of Spanish Succession with its alliance with Britain and military leadership of Prince Eugene. And one of the famous pieces, so Emperor Charles VI was one of the ones who helped to defend against France in the War of Spanish Succession by allying with Britain. Emperor Charles VI famously had no sons, but he did have a daughter, and his daughter's name was Maria Theresa, or Maria Theresa. And, traditionally in the Habsburg Eastern empires, they tend to be a little bit more conservative. So whereas in England we've seen female queens running the land, like Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary II and so on, in the Habsburg dynasty, there was something known, an old tradition known as Salic law, S-A-L-I-C. Salic law basically said that a European king, ruler, could only pass on the heir to the throne to a son. That was what Salic law was. So passing the throne on to a daughter was outside the bounds of the Salic law. And so in order to circumvent the Salic law in 1713, Emperor Charles VI issued what was known as the pragmatic sanction. Pragmatic. When you do something pragmatically, you're doing something in a rational way. So when we say pragmatic, it's practical. Okay, it is effective, it's efficient. And so pragmatic sanction, and what this basically said was that Habsburg lands were never to be divided, and they were to be passed intact to a single heir. And that heir, the law of pragmatic sanction, issued by Charles VI, meant that when he died, his daughter Maria Theresa would inherit Charles's empire in 1740, and she does. She rules for 40 years. However, the rest of Europe is going to use this as an opportunity to strike against Austria. And so this issue of pragmatic sanction, actually upon Charles VI's death, results in something known as the War of Austrian Succession. Okay, now remember, when I say the War of Austrian Succession and the War of Spanish Succession, that is not the same as secession. Okay, succession versus secession. If you secede, okay, you're breaking away. If you succeed, you are inheriting the throne from someone. Okay, and so when we say the War of Austrian Succession, what we're talking about is who is going to succeed Charles VI in the throne of the Habsburg Austrian Empire. And it will be his daughter, but not without a struggle. And the main threat posed to Austria during the War of Austrian Succession in 1740 comes from the Prussians, the Germans. Okay, remember that Prussia will be the state that ultimately organizes the centralization of the German Empire in the late 1800s. Now, at the time, Prussia, aka previously known as the Kingdom of Brandenburg, was run by a dynasty known as the Hohenzollern Dynasty. The Hohenzollern Dynasty, basically the background here is that the ruler of Brandenburg became one of 7 electors in the Holy Roman Empire in 1417. Yet by the 17th century, Brandenburg was still not significantly involved in Holy Roman Empire affairs. Marriages, though, increasingly gave the Hohenzollerns control of German principalities in central and western Germany. And the prince had very little power over the nobility within the Hohenzollern dynasty until it starts to become more absolutist under Frederick William, also known as the Great Elector of Brandenburg. So Frederick William of Brandenburg was the king of Brandenburg. He reigned from 1640 until 1688. A little bit of background on Frederick William, the Great Elector. He was a strict Calvinist, but granted toleration to Jews and Catholics. He was admired, he admired the Swedish system of government and the Dutch economic power and tried to mimic that in his own state. He was very much threatened by the Swedish-Polish struggle in the Baltic and wars of Louis XIV, and this put the Kingdom of Brandenburg into a state of permanent crisis. But nonetheless, during this period of time, Frederick William, the Great Elector, was able to take advantage of that and establish Prussia as a great power and laid foundation for the future unification of Germany. So the most significant contributions of Frederick William, the Great Elector, was that he oversaw Prussian militarism and created the most efficient army in Europe. So despite its relatively small size, Brandenburg, aka Prussia, became one of the most powerful standing militaries in all of Europe. Despite the fact that it was so small, they were like the maybe 4th largest military or something like that. Also, he unified his Rhine River holdings so that Prussia and Brandenburg were integrated into a strong state. And he also implemented heavy taxation for military spending. In fact, this tiny little state of Brandenburg was spending twice the amount on their military as Louis XIV was. And so the growth of Brandenburg Prussia from 1600 to 1795, you can see that the Duchy of Prussia starts off as just that little green territory up over here. Through marriages and through conquering, they acquire territories in various places. And you have acquisitions in 1600 to 1772 from Silesia to Pomerania up here. Here's Brandenburg over here. Okay, and between Brandenburg and Prussia, they essentially unify into a single state known as Prussia. Now, the noble class of the Prussians is known as the Junker class. I know it looks like Junkers, but it's Junkers. Okay, the Junker class, and they formed the backbone of the Prussian military officer corps. Now, these nobles and landowners dominated the estates of Brandenburg and Prussia. The Junkers in Prussia, once again, are still going to be more powerful than, say, the nobles over in Western Europe. In 1653, hereditary subjugation of serfs, meaning that serfs inherited their title of being a serf, was established as a way of compensating the nobles for their support of the crown. So as they supported the crown on one side of political affairs, they gained power over the people beneath them. And that is one thing that is unique about Eastern absolutism that makes it different from Western absolutism, is that in Eastern Europe, the nobles were significantly more powerful. However, their power was derived not from subjugating the king, but from subjugating people beneath them on the social hierarchy, while at the same time supporting the crown. Junkers were often young land-owning lords, and their influence over the land and the Prussian military gave them power that perhaps nobles in Western Europe did not possess. Also, he encouraged, Frederick William, the Great Elector, encouraged industry and trade. He imported skilled craftsmen and Dutch farmers. New industries began to emerge in Prussia, such as wool, cotton, linen, velvet, lace, silk, soap, paper, and iron products. And then his efforts at overseas trade largely failed due to Prussia's lack of ports and lack of naval experience. Plus, it would have been really hard for Prussia to get into the naval game this late in the game, because by this point, the Dutch, the English, the French have already significantly established themselves as a global naval power. Frederick I was sometimes known as the ostentatious, the first quote-unquote king of Prussia. In some ways, he was very much the most popular Hohenzollern. He sought to imitate the court of Louis XIV. He very much encouraged higher education, and he actually ended up fighting 2 wars against Louis XIV to maintain the balance of power. For example, the 2 wars that he fought in against France was the War of the League of Augsburg and the War of Spanish Succession, both of which we talked about earlier in this unit. And he allied with the Habsburgs, and after the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which brought the War of Spanish Succession to a close, the Elector of Brandenburg Prussia was now recognized internationally as the King of Prussia in return for its aid to the Habsburgs in their fight against the French. Perhaps one of the most famous kings in European history is Frederick William I. Now, you might wonder, wasn't there already a Frederick William I? Remember that Frederick William, the Great Elector, was from Brandenburg, and so we don't really refer to him as Frederick I. We refer to Frederick William I. Rather, we refer to Frederick William I of Prussia as being the Soldatenkönig, or the Soldiers' King. And so the Soldatenkönig is the soldier king of Prussia, known as Frederick William I, and he established Prussian absolutism. He began infusing militarism into the society. They sometimes referred to Prussia as the Sparta of the North. They had a very, when we talk about Sparta, or the ancient Greek city-state of Sparta, you might know the Spartans for having a really small but particularly effective and militaristic society. They were very much like a warrior society, and that's kind of what Frederick William I, the soldier king, tries to implement in Prussia. Under Frederick William I, they nearly double the army's size. In fact, by this time, they have really, for their size, the best army in Europe, even though they're the fourth largest army behind France, Russia, and Austria. So the Prussians were developing militaristically significantly very much during this age of absolutism, but especially under Frederick William I, who reigned from the very final year of the War of Spanish Succession in 1713 all the way up to 1740, right about the same time as Charles VI, the Austrian Habsburg ruler, was ruling just further south of Prussia. And 80% of all revenues that the state collected from taxes went to the military. They had an army that was designed essentially to deter war because no one wanted to go to war with the Prussians. It's one of those things, basically the philosophy was very simple behind why they built up this military. And the philosophy behind it was purely so that they built such a strong military that it made it very discouraging for other nations to want to go to war with them to deter. So they do it to deter war rather than to use their military to go and conquer other places. Prussia had developed under Frederick William I the most efficient bureaucracy in Europe. And this is in part because Junkers remained the officers' castle in the army in return for support of the king's absolutism. Again, going back to this idea where it's like the nobles are able to be granted the highest ranking positions within the military so long as they remain loyal to the king and offer him their support. So he also, under Frederick William I, established compulsory education for children in 1717, where he established about 1,000 schools for peasant children. Once again, the Germans putting a heavy emphasis on education. And even today, when we talk about kindergarten is a German practice. It was used to educate small children in the years before they went to school. And so Junkers were land-owning lords. Their influence over the land in Prussian army gave them a bunch of power, remember. After Frederick William I passes away in 1740, we see the new king of Prussia is Frederick II, and he gets known as Frederick the Great. And he's also known as an enlightened despot who, perhaps you remember watching the documentary about Catherine the Great of Russia. Catherine the Great of Russia, also known as Catherine II of Russia, was the Tsarina of Russia. She is also considered an enlightened absolutist monarch, or an enlightened despot, as they're sometimes known, along with Frederick II of Austria, as well as a third monarch from Europe during this time, known as Joseph II of Austria. But you'll notice that while Frederick II and Catherine II both have the title the Great after their name, Joseph II does not have the title the Great after his name. And we'll find out why a little bit later when we actually get to the section on enlightened absolutism. But that's a little bit ahead of where we're at right now, so I'm only giving you a brief gloss over of Frederick II. He was basically the most powerful and famous of the Prussian kings. He was considered to be an enlightened despot for his incorporation of using Enlightenment ideas, which, again, we haven't talked about the Enlightenment yet, so I don't expect you yet to know what that is. But nonetheless, just to put in your, kind of in the back of your head that Frederick II is going to be a name that we talk about coming up again in the future. And he instituted a number of important reforms and increased Prussia's territory at the expense of the Austrians, particularly because Frederick II, when he first comes to power in 1740, wages a war against the Austrian Habsburgs over that territory known as Silesia. And so they gain Silesia. And then, too, it's under Frederick II that those partitions of Poland take place, where Prussia is increasing its land at the expense of taking land from Poland. The last place that we're going to be talking about in terms of the rise of Eastern absolutism is Russia. And so remember Hop-Rap, the three dying ones are the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Polish kingdom. And then Rap is the rising ones, and that's going to be Russia, Austria, and the Prussians. And so we still have to talk about Russia. And so even though you did watch that documentary on it, I'm going to go in and just review some things here. Historical background on Russia. Russia is part of the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the Greek Orthodox Church, which assimilated descendants of the Vikings with the Slavs. And in the 13th century, the 1200s, the Mongols from the east invaded Russia and actually ruled in those territories of Russia for about 2 centuries. And eventually the princes of Moscow, which at the time was called Muscovy, who served the Khan, which was the leader of the Mongols, began to consolidate their own rule and replaced the Mongols with their own leaders. Ivan I and Ivan III were the most important of those early Muscovy rulers, or Russian rulers, if you want to call them that, even though they didn't really think of themselves yet as Russian at that time. I'm going to delete that. Historical background on Russia. Muscovy began to emerge as the most significant principality that formed the nucleus of what later became Russia. However, the Russian nobles, which were known as boyars, so remember the Junkers are from Prussia, the boyars are from Russia, and both of them are representative of the nobles of their respective territories. The free peasantry made it very difficult for the Muscovite rulers to strengthen the state, because the nobles were relatively powerful and you had free peasants, and this is why they began to institute serfdom in Russia, or in Muscovy as it was called at the time. Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great, ruled from 1442 to 1505, and in 1480 he ended Mongol domination of Muscovy. He declared himself the hereditary ruler of Russia, and this was in response to the fall of the Byzantine Empire and his desire to make Moscow the new center of the Orthodox Church, sometimes called the Third Rome. In fact, that title, Tsar, T-S-A-R or C-Z-A-R, is actually a derivative of the term Caesar. Okay, so when we say Tsar or Tsar, however you pronounce it, it's actually it's the etymology of it goes back to the ancient Roman Empire, where the title of the emperor was Caesar, and so that's where we get that word. He also started importing Greek scholars, craftsmen, architects, artists to begin building up Muscovy. Ivan the Great also declared absolutism was derived from divine right. You'll note that came before even the writings of Jacques Bossuet, who we read earlier on in the unit. Ivan the Great struggled with boyars for power because the boyars did not want to see their own political authority diminish at the hands of the Tsar. But eventually, power of the boyars was reduced, but they gained greater control over their peasants, who increasingly became serfs. And then you have Ivan IV, who was known sometimes as Ivan the Terrible, who ruled from 1533 to 1584. A little bit of background on Ivan the Terrible. He was the grandson of Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great. He was also the first Muscovy ruler to take the title of Tsar, and he married a Romanov. And the Romanov Dynasty is the one that ultimately ends up consolidating power in Russia for the following 300 years, essentially. But territorial expansion under Ivan IV, basically under Ivan IV, the Russians controlled the Black Sea region. They won huge eastern territories. They also gained territories in the Baltic, in what is now places like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and places like that. Remember, the Baltic is up here, okay, in these regions over here, and then the Balkans are down over in this region here. So please don't get those confused. I'm talking about the Baltic region that expanded under Ivan the Terrible in these areas up in this region in northern Europe. Under Ivan IV, he ordered the construction of what became known as St. Basils or St. Basils Cathedral, which was built to commemorate Muscovy's victory over the Kazan and Astrakhan, and the structure was completed around 1555 to 1561. Now, of course, if you've ever seen this image before, this is a classic historical building that is typically architecturally associated with Russia because of its inspiration from Eastern Orthodox Christianity themes and Eastern architecture. You don't see cathedrals that look like this in Western Europe because, once again, the history is different in Eastern Europe than it is in Western Europe. And here it is lit up at night. St. Basils Cathedral. And then we move on to the process of Westernization, where under Ivan the Terrible, he encouraged trade with England and the Netherlands. He waged a costly war with Poland-Lithuania for 25 years. Many peasants fled east and formed bands of outlaws known as Cossacks. So Cossacks were Russian peasants who fled east and became outlaws. The Cossacks were a challenge to the rule of the Russian nobles, the boyars. So this actually, under Ivan the Terrible, although the boyars are increasing their power over the serfs, you do see some resistance from that by the Cossacks. And then, of course, Ivan the Terrible is also trying to diminish the power of the boyars. All nobles had to serve the Tsar in order to keep their lands, and that's one way in which absolutism manifests in Russia. Merchants and artisans were bound to their towns, so they weren't able to travel freely. And then Russia enters into a period known as the Time of Troubles after Ivan the Terrible's death, where from about 1584 to 1613, you kind of have this power vacuum in Russia where they're not entirely sure what direction to move. This was a period of time characterized by famine, which is food shortages from crop failures, power struggles, as well as war. And Cossack bands began traveling northward, killing nobles and officials. Remember that the Cossacks were those peasant outlaws that moved east and were causing problems for the boyars. Sweden and Poland in this time period ended up conquering Moscow. And so Moscow, Muscovy, Russia really faced about 30 years, I guess, of pretty difficult times where it could have really wiped them right off the map had Sweden and Poland continued to be able to conquer and retain control over Russian territories. Nobles needed to figure out how to move about, from this situation, move forward from it. And so they elected Ivan's grandnephew, named Michael Romanov, as the new hereditary Tsar. And this is the beginning of what becomes known as the Romanov Dynasty. And that's in part because, once again, remember, Ivan the Terrible, fatefully back in his days, married a Romanov, and it was as a byproduct of that marriage that Michael Romanov becomes named the ruler of Russia. And so the Romanov dynasty lasts 300 years, from 1613 all the way up to 1917, which for the record was only 103 years ago, which is not that long in the grand scheme of history. 100 years ago is a drop in the bucket. And the first of the Romanov dynasty was Michael Romanov, and it lasted all the way up to the last Tsar of Russia of the Romanov dynasty, and that was Nicholas II. Tsar Nicholas II is the last member of the Romanov dynasty. And Michael Romanov, in terms of the way that he ruled, he reigned from 1613 up to 1645. He favored nobles in return for their support. He expanded the Russian Empire eastward to the Pacific Ocean. And changes in Russian society occurred during this time. Nobles started gaining military exemptions. The rights of peasants declined significantly under Michael Romanov. And there were these folks called Old Believers who resisted these new religious sects that were developing from the West, such as Lutheranism and Calvinism. And Old Believers severely were persecuted by the government. And during this period of Westernization, as Russia is beginning to adopt more Western practices of like, say, the French and so on, by 1689, Russia ends up becoming the world's largest country. It's, in fact, 3 times the entire size of the continent of Europe, if you include all of their Asian territories that they had acquired. early on in the Romanov Dynasty. Now, the most famous of all of the Romanov rulers is without a question Peter the Great. And Peter the Great reigned from 1682 all the way up to 1725, so he has a nice long reign. Remember that, you might have learned this in the documentary, Peter the Great was absolutely gargantuan for his time. He was a huge, huge man, okay, taller than me. He was nearly 7 feet tall. He stood at about 6 feet 9 inches tall. And so he was a tall drink of water. He was a big, big dude. And he had a big personality to go along with it. And you might have heard in the documentary that his sister, Sophia, ruled as his regent early on. And she had actually developed a plot with a number of other boyars, Russian nobles, to kill him, but it failed. And Peter had her banished to a monastery where he hanged the bodies of the co-conspirators of this plot for her to have to look at outside of her window. So he was a ruthless, ruthless leader, and he began ruling in his own right at age 22. He did have some health problems, particularly, I believe, bladder problems and other things like that. But that Streltsy revolt was defeated by Peter in 1698, and you might remember the image that they showed you in the documentary about the Streltsy revolt, the painting that was done, and the look that Peter the Great had on his face, which, by the way, was such a great... Let's just pull that up because I absolutely love that. The Streltsy revolt, rebellion, images. Here it is. Good old Wikipedia never lets you down, right? All right, here we go. Here, look at that look that he's got on his face. He's got this look like just, he's given the, let me see here. There it is. He's given the death stare. Look at that. Look at that look on his face. That is a look of a man who is on a mission, right? And so there's the Streltsy revolt, and you can see here the subdual of this revolt that enabled absolutism to be encouraged and grow in Russia under Peter the Great. So the revolt of the Streltsy was put down, and these Moscow guards had overthrown previous leaders, and the security of Peter's reign was now intact because the Streltsy had been subdued. Peter was so strong he could bend horseshoes with his bare hands. He was like I said, just a massive individual. And so this painting was given to King William III of England, and that's done by Sir Godfrey Kneller. All right. During his reign, Peter the Great's major concern was developing Russia as a military power. Remember that Russia had remained relatively weak militarily and subject to peasant revolts by the Cossacks, as well as noble revolts by the Streltsy guards and people like that. And so each Russian village was required to send recruits to the army for 25-year enlistments. Now, that's a that may as well be a lifelong enlistment at this time, because, you know, if you enlist in the military today, all right, it's a 4-year enlistment, and then after 4 years, you have the option to, to re-enlist. But in many cases, people will just do, 1, maybe 2 terms in the military, and they're done after 4 or 8 years. In Russia, if you were sent into the military, it was a 25-year enlistment, which meant that essentially you were going to be there for most of your adult life. And 75% of the national budget of Russia begins to be spent on the military. There was a Royal Army of Russia of over 200,000 men, plus an additional 100,000 special forces of Cossacks and foreigners who were brought into the military as well. And they established royal military and artillery academies in order to train these folks. All young male nobles were required to leave home and serve 5 years of compulsory education. Compulsory just means mandatory. And under Peter the Great, they develop a very large navy built on the Baltic, although it does decline after Peter the Great's death. Non-nobles also had opportunities to rise up the ranks. You also had, under Peter the Great Northern War, which was one of the most significant wars fought by Peter the Great. The Great Northern War lasted from 1700 to 1721, which means that it was going on right at the same time, at least for the first part of it, as the War of Spanish Succession. But the Russians weren't that interested in what was going on in Spain and Western Europe at this time in terms of the political future of Spain. And so they were preoccupied with regions that were more closely located to where they were, particularly Sweden and those regions of what is now known as Scandinavia. So the Great Northern War was a war fought between Russia, with Poland, Denmark, and Saxony, a German state, as allies, versus Sweden under Charles XII. And the major battle of the Great Northern War was the Battle of Poltava, which was the most decisive battle in Russia defeating Sweden in 1709. The Great Northern War came to a conclusion with something known as the Treaty of Nystad, which is where Russia gained the territories officially of Latvia and Estonia, and thus gained its, quote, window to the west in the Baltic Sea, meaning that after obtaining these territories along the Baltic Sea, they were now able to begin trading with the West, places like England, France, Denmark, as well as the Dutch Republic. Okay? And you can see here, these are the Russian gains with the green stripe right here. And this is really what enables, because you see, if you build a port here that's still landlocked, so they needed these regions here, what are now Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, all the way down into these regions here, in order to gain access to the sea and be able to trade effectively with Western Europe. Under Peter the Great, there's a lot of modernization and westernization that happens because he focuses greatly on, once again, modeling his nation after Western Europe, which was perceived by the Russians to be the quintessential home of absolutism, particularly embodied by the French King Louis XIV. Who coexisted alongside Peter the Great in the in the early 1700s, shortly before Louis XIV's death in 1713. And so, modernization and westernization. He traveled to Europe, Western Europe, as a young man. Peter the Great did, to study its technology and culture. He also began importing many Western technicians and craftsmen to begin aiding the Russians in building large factories. Remember, the types of factories that they're building at this time are not going to be industrial type factories. They're factories where handmade goods are made rather than machine-made goods. And by 1725, Russia outproduced England in iron, but not Sweden or Germany. And industrial serfdom existed in factories where workers could be bought and sold by the actual factory owners. But remember, again, I need to encourage you to remember that the types of factories that you typically would think of when you think of a factory of the Industrial Revolution are not exactly what these look like, okay? Also, another famous move of Peter the Great was after he returned from Western Europe, Peter the Great decreed, in other words, demanded that the boyars, the Russian nobles, cease wearing the long traditional robes and to cut their beards. And if you wanted to keep your old noble beard, you had to literally pay a tax to have a long noble beard, a boyar beard, okay? And this was one of several efforts by Peter the Great to westernize Russian society and make the Russians appear to be more of a legitimate European power to the rest of Western Europe. So they are mimicking Western Europe in order to become more like Western Europe, but also to compete and gain the respect with Western Europe as well. So under Peter the Great, the government became more efficient. The Tsar basically just ruled by decree, which was yet another example of Eastern absolutism, where the Tsar basically just issues these decrees, these orders that he expects people to follow. and remain loyal to him. One of the ways that the government became more efficient under Peter the Great was something called the Table of Ranks. And what the Table of Ranks did was it set educational standards for civil servants, most of whom were, of course, going to be nobles, boyars. All right, so they had to have a certain degree of education in order to serve in the Russian state. Peter sought to replace the old boyar nobility with new service-based nobility that was loyal to the Tsar, and that sounds probably very, very similar to the granting of the Noble of the Robes by Louis XIV to new nobles in France, and to try to subdue the old nobles of the sword. Very similar tactic that Peter the Great is kind of taking from the playbook of Louis XIV here in terms of establishing absolutism in his state. Russian secret police both ruthlessly and efficiently crushed the opponents of the state. And so they are using a secret police force, essentially a network of spies who would root out conspirators against the state before they had a chance to get their plots off the ground and challenge the rule of Peter the Great. Also, taxation under the Table of Ranks, taxation under the rule of Peter the Great was heavy on trade and rent, and there was a head tax on every male that was particularly serfs and so on. And so this, of course, increases the revenue for the state, which was spent on developing the navy and the military. And then also under Peter the Great, there was increased control of the Russian Orthodox Church, which had traditionally, just like in Eastern Europe, where the Catholic Church had been a challenge to king's authority, and kings across Europe, like Louis XIV, and so on, subdued the power of the church. Again, Russia takes a similar tactic in subduing the power of the Russian Orthodox Church, so that the king subdues the church to his rule. St. Petersburg is at this time becomes the capital of Russia. And it's no longer the capital of Russia. Moscow is the capital of Russia today, but for a time St. Petersburg was. And establishing St. Petersburg was really one of Peter's crowning achievements. He sought to create a city similar to Amsterdam, meaning he wanted it to be a profitable port city where he would be able to import and export goods in and out of Russia. The Peterhof Palace, was modeled after the grandeur of the Palace of Versailles. In fact, Peterhof Palace sometimes has the nickname Versailles of the East, and that's because it is very, very similar both in design and in opulence to the Versailles Palace all the way over in just outside of Paris. By his death, Peter the Great, had established essentially the largest city in Northern Europe, with 75,000 inhabitants, and St. Petersburg ultimately became the capital of Russia, and it was very cosmopolitan in character. St. Petersburg was kind of an up-and-coming town. The construction of St. Petersburg had begun in 1703. The labor they used was conscripted. In other words, people didn't have a choice. They were just forced into labor servitude of the state to build the city of St. Petersburg. Peter the Great ordered many noble families to move to the city and build their homes according to Peter's plans, very similar to the way in which Louis XIV would force various noble families to spend some of their year living at Versailles. And merchants and artisans were also ordered to live in the city and to help build it, because you can't have a city without a decent middle class of artisans and then other kind of upper echelon peasant type workers like carpenters or masons, like bricklayers, people like that. And so these types of people were also forced to live in the city, and peasants were conscripted into heavy labor in the city's construction, and there was also a very heavy death toll. As many as 100,000 peasants died in the process of making St. Petersburg an actual city. Here you can see an image of the Peterhof Palace. This image is, it's in St. Petersburg. It's at Peterhof Palace. Not all times in history did Peterhof Palace look this beautiful. It has been entirely destroyed in World War II, because Peterhof Palace is not in the inner city of St. Petersburg. It's kind of on the outskirts. it was destroyed by the Nazis. And so when the Nazis invaded Russia, they did make it to Peterhof Palace. And if you go to Peterhof Palace, you'll be able to see images of what the place looked like after the Nazis had gotten done invading Russia. And the Russians successfully pushed them back. But there was not much left of the Peterhof Palace, either inside or out. It was essentially pretty much ruins, and they had to completely rebuild and revitalize the entire palace to make it look like it used to look prior to World War II happening in 1939 to 1945. You can see that, again, it has a very similar type of feel to it as the Palace of Versailles does. You've got this huge palace, and then beyond that you have in the backyard this massive gardens and forests and stuff. And you can go there and walk around, and it's very, very beautiful. Peterhof Palace, you can see there the fountains and the gilded architecture, just as we've seen in Versailles, as well as the ornate, paintings on the ceilings, the frescoes that you see in Versailles as well. And then here's the Winter Palace, which will come up in our story when we get to the Russian Revolution. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg received a major overhaul under Queen Catherine I, who was Peter the Great's daughter, who ended up becoming the Tsarina. And so under Catherine the First, not Catherine the Great, that was Catherine the Second, but under Catherine the First, daughter of Peter the Great, you can see a complete revitalization of the Catherine Palace as well. And you can go here, and it's very, very beautiful too. So, and here you can see it's kind of a zoomed out view. The day that I was at the Catherine Palace, this is taken in the fall time, very pretty picture with all of these trees changing colors here. But anyhow, when I was there, it was raining that day in Russia, and so the weather was not that great when I was there visiting the Catherine Palace. But nonetheless, it's a beautiful, beautiful palace, and you can see the influence of both neoclassical but mostly Baroque style architecture. The neoclassical, you see that a bit in these pillars, the triangular pediments here. But in terms of everything else, it's very typically Baroque, with all of the gilded statues and ornate sculptures and stuff like that that adorn the building. Peter's reforms ultimately ended up modernizing Russia, and it brought it closer to the European mainstream, meaning what was going on in Western Europe at the time. They developed a more modern military, a more modern state bureaucracy. He was able to subdue the powers of the nobles to him, although the powers of the nobles increased with respect to people beneath them on the social hierarchy, meaning like serfs and people like that. And Russia begins emerging in terms of as a European power because of its size and its military growth. And there's also this emerging concept of interest in the state as separate from the Tsar's interests. So the Tsar began issuing explanations to his decrees to gain popular support during this time. And so rather than just issuing decrees, he would offer an explanation of why the decree was being put into place, and this helped him gain support for his policies. All right. So this brings us to the end of the section on Eastern absolutism. Now, there is technically one more section in this unit that we have already lectured on, and that is the lecture that I did in the last unit, because it's hard to fit in everything. We've been in this unit now for a couple of weeks, and we do have to begin to wrap things up here. But basically, we will on Friday be doing a review of English constitutionalism in the Dutch Republic, but I'm not going to spend as much time going into details on everything. That being said, there is one last little section of your reading guide of about, 13 or 14 questions or something like that have to do with the rise of constitutionalism in England and the Dutch Republic, the Dutch Golden Age, which once again, as I mentioned, I've already lectured on those things. We are simply going to be doing some review of those ideas on Friday because it kind of fits in with some of the other stuff as a contrast to whereas most of Europe was going through this time of absolutism, we do have to keep in mind that there was the alternative motive that happened in England, which became Britain in 1707, which is the constitutional style monarchy rather than the absolute style monarchy. And so I just want to remind you of some of that so that you can use that as a compare and contrast. And you will be asked questions on this exam pertaining to constitutionalism and the Dutch Republic. So do expect that kind of content to be included on this unit exam. In terms of the exam, right now we're looking at probably having the test next Monday, possibly though next Wednesday. It depends on kind of how things shape up here in the next little bit. So for now, tentatively plan for having the next test on Monday, but we may push it to Wednesday because I may use Monday as more of a bit, because this unit is kind of long, I may end up using Monday as a bit of a review day to go back and just review with you some of the concepts that we've talked about, because this is kind of a big unit and there's a lot of different places that we talked about, people that we talked about, ideas that we talked about, and so I may end up just using Monday as a bit of a review day. It just kind of depends. I have to check the calendar and make some determinations on that. Also, we are coming up here in the next 10 days on Halloween, and being that we won't have many other opportunities to talk much about it, I would like to spend some time talking a bit about witchcraft, which is rather pertinent to what we're talking about, because we are going to see the death of things like ideas of witchcraft and black magic and arcane arts and other things like that die off with the religious movements that were going on in Europe leading up to the 30 Years' War. Remember that the 30 Years' War being the last religious war of Europe, what ends up happening is that religious institutions end up being slightly less powerful after the 30 Years' War in terms of the scheme of the European, statecraft. And as a result of that, witchcraft ends up kind of dying out afterwards. Also, increasingly, people are beginning to have more and more scientific explanations of the universe. And we will be talking more about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment coming up in our next unit, Unit 5. But anyhow, the reason I'm explaining this is because I was thinking about offering some extra credit to the class. It's extra credit that I've offered before. It's somewhat related to Halloween, not really, but only in the sense that it's about witchcraft. Okay, only in the sense that it's about witchcraft, but it is a historically relevant documentary, and but it is brutal, and history is brutal sometimes, and so I just do need to kind of warn you that you kind of need to use discretion when you're watching this documentary and understand that you're going to be exposed to some kind of gruesome stories in history that kind of push the limits of stuff that you've been exposed to before, but it's available on Netflix, and I'll be posting the extra credit assignment on Canvas and letting you know what you need to do in order to gain credit on that. And we'll talk maybe a bit more about that on Friday as well. But basically, I'll give you, I don't know, probably about 10 days or something like that from the point of me assigning it to get this extra credit assignment done, should you decide that you want to do it. You don't have to do it, obviously. It is optional. It's one of those things where, again, this is a thing I've assigned many times in the past. There's a couple maybe slightly, controversial topics that it talks about in this documentary on witchcraft, but it is nonetheless pretty historically accurate and relevant to make sense of why witchcraft even was a thing at all, why witch hunting became a thing, and the persecution of women, particularly in Europe, in terms of understanding gender history. It's a very important kind of lesson to understand in history about the role of patriarchy and the subduing of women in society. And so that's another reason that I think that this documentary is worth watching. But again, it is optional, so you don't have to do it if you don't want to. Today for your assignment, I'll be posting in just a little bit here some online quizzes that you can use to begin reviewing some of this stuff. Some of them will have lectures from Professor Fix attached to them, but most of it is simply going to be a review of some of the things that I've been talking about in the lectures online here as we have progressed throughout the unit. So I should suspect that probably a lot of these things that you will be exposed to in these quizzes will be things that you already have a pretty good handle on. But nonetheless, if you want to watch Professor Fix as a supplementary to the lectures that I've been offering you in class, you are, of course, more than welcome to do so. And make sure to get those quizzes done also as your homework for Friday. So, with that, kids, I will call an end to today's lecture. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in this morning. Make sure you sign on to Schoology and do what you need to do to get stuff done. And, have a great rest of the day.